what happened in Japan and why are folks like you and me looking at each other and calling this the biggest moment in the history of Japanese democracy? Is that too far? Because I've been using that line, and I think it's kind of, I don't know. Like, you tell me if I'm engaging in hyperbole, and tell us what happened.
I mean, it's definitely an inflection point. I mean, I don't think you can look at the numbers of what happened and not see it as that. And um, so, long story, deeply compressed. Of course, in January, after saying that she wasn't going to call an election, she was focused on the budget. Of course, Prime Minister Takaichi did an about face. She decided she would call an election. Japan has a 16-day campaign. It is the shortest campaign Japan has ever had. And the outcome of it is that the LDP wins 316 seats, which is a supermajority of its own. And recall that before the election, it did not even have a majority of its own, let alone anywhere close to a supermajority. So the LDP picks up somewhere in the neighborhood of let me think about this, 100 and somewhere around 120 seats. It actually should have been more. And the LDP did so well and outperformed its own expectations that they actually ended up having to give 14 proportional seats to other parties because they ran out of candidates, because they were not expecting, because they have this system where you can list, they have this double vote system where you have 289 seats are constituency races and the remainder are proportional races, and you can have some of the losers from the constituency races uh, listed as proportional candidates, so they basically can get in through the back door. And they won so many seats in so many places that they ran out of proportional candidates because they just assumed that some of those constituency candidates would lose. And so they actually should have had 330 seats. That's how big the victory was.
I confess, I have never, I mean, maybe listeners will give me some examples. I have never heard of that happening in democratic politics anywhere in the world in my lifetime. If you're a listener and you can give me some trivia on when that's happened before, where like a leading party didn't field enough seats to capitalize on their victory, let me know, because it's just mind blowing.
It's happened. So actually, it happened in the last general election in
Oh, okay.
2024 in Japan, not for the LDP. It happened for the Democratic Party for the People, which, like they were the big breakout star of the 2024 general election. And they ended up, I'm trying to remember, it was a small handful of, they just like ran out of proportional candidates. They just did not, they did better than they expected, and they had to give up seats that they had won. So it can happen. It is a quirk of this system they have, and maybe it's an argument in favor of electoral reform. But so anyway, so I mean, biggest victory, the LDP is it just celebrated its 70th birthday, right? Like this is a larger majority than the LDP has had over the course of 70 years. It's had a lot of big majorities. It has never had a majority this big. So, I mean, that alone is a big deal. But I think what also makes it a big deal is that the opposition collapsed across the board. So, the biggest story, and the reason why it ended up being such a big victory for the LDP is that, so Takaichi gambles on an election, and you immediately afterwards you get a sort of counter gamble. You had the Constitutional Democratic Party, which is sort of the evolved form of the old Democratic Party for Japan, which has been sort of the main opposition party, announced on very short notice that it was going to merge with Komeito, the party that until last fall had been the LDP's coalition partner for 26 something years. And there was a certain amount of policy overlap. Like on paper, you could see the reasoning behind that cooperation. You could see like, okay, like they're, like very much like in the center of politics, sort of a more moderate political style, kind of rejecting some of the more kind of radical positions of the LDP's right wing. Like you can see how they got to the point where like this could make sense, and also you can see electorally. I mean, Komeito had has a nationwide network. It's helped elect LDP candidates for a lot of years. It was just a very useful partner for the LDP for a long time. So you could see, oh, like we want to steal a march on the LDP. Let's tie up with Komeito and see what can happen with it. So they announced very suddenly the creation of something called the Centrist Reform Alliance. Maybe the fact that they just have centrist in the name is the first sign of trouble. But so you have this counter maneuver. And, if you were looking at the Japanese political reporting, I mean, the LDP was nervous about this because they were wondering, like, oh, like we were hoping that some of, like Komeito voters would stick with us because they voted for LDP candidates for all these years. And maybe this means they won't. But what actually ended up happening is that, I mean, utter collapse. I mean, like CDP voters didn't want to vote for the new party. Komeito voters basically didn't want to vote for the new party. And so they went into the election with 167 seats and they came out of it with 49, which is just, I mean, it's hard to emphasize the degree to which, I mean, you look at the map and I mean, it is just a sea of red. I mean, the LDP won, Tokyo has 30 seats. The LDP won every single seat in Tokyo. The LDP, I mean, in like the greater Tokyo area, there's 80 seats. The LDP won all but one of those seats. I mean, it's just just like the scale of the victory is so extreme that can only be explained by just like the utter collapse in support for the opposition. So that's why, I mean, it was, it's partly Takaichi's popularity, but it's also that you had this counter gamble that failed to a greater extent than you could possibly imagine. Like, and everyone was surprised. I mean, so the LGP was surprised. I think, a lot of observers were surprised. I mean, this was just, orders of magnitude bigger than what seemed possible. Um, so just a huge wipeout. And I should also add that not just like this sort of centrist mainstream opposition collapsed, but there's basically no left wing opposition left either. The Japanese Communist Party lost half its seats, so it only has 4 seats left. The sort of younger left wing party that basically has the same politics as the Communist Party, Reiwa Shinsengumi, only has 1 seat. And the only reason it has 1 seat is because the LDP gifted it one of the seats that it didn't have a candidate to fill. So, I mean, like, there's basically no left wing left. The centrist opposition has collapsed. Some of the sort of upstart right wing parties have, kind of held on, but fell far short of expectations. I mean, it was just, like it was just a sweeping across the board, like LDP completely dominant victory. And whatever sort of source of political opposition there is to Prime Minister Takaichi now, I mean, it's gone. Like, there's no real institutional barriers within the legislature anymore.
Yeah, we're going to get to all that and the constraints on her, and I think you're right. And so, although I want to talk about the upper house in a little bit, but let's talk about the result for a little bit longer, because it's difficult to parse. Because you talked about the collapse of the opposition, we talked about Takaichi's popularity, and then there's also the LDP itself, which has been. I mean, the LDP's had a rough couple of years, mired in scandal, low approval ratings, haven't been able to put one foot in front of the other. Even before Abe was assassinated, things weren't going well. So, like, how do you, when you're trying to explain what happened in Japanese politics, how do you explain it? Do you put more weight on the collapse of the opposition and that in the next election it won't be this way? Is it just that Takaichi is a one of one, and she, just as long as she's like a Modi or something like that, or even a Trump, somebody who is just going to have the magic, and as long as she's pulling the strings, she'll have the magic, but maybe she'll struggle. Did the LDP do something? Is there something in the water? Is Japanese society waking up and saying, are they looking at China and looking at the United States and being like, we really do need somebody who's going to be a little bit tougher, and this is the person that's tougher on the menu? Like, what is happening, do you think, in with the median Japanese voter? Because the one other thing I wanted to ask you about too was, the voter turnout was what, 56, 57%? So not huge. So at least, a large number of Japanese voters are saying none of the above, which I think is also an important data point. So talk to me about what you think this tells us about Japanese society, and where the blame goes, or where the credit goes. I don't know. Help me.
I mean, that's kind of it's such a huge question that gets right to the heart of the matter. I mean, and it's really all the above, and we can kind of walk through each of the threads because, of course, when you have, a massive outlier event, there's never a single cause, right? There's always, multiple factors to explain it. Anything interesting that, needs to be explained usually has more than one factor behind it. I would say, first, like, just like the extreme size of the LDP's victory. I mean, that was, I mean, inflated by the opposition's collapse because, the opposition lost in places that they have, I mean, that they've basically never really lost in. So the fact, the marginal seats that the LDP was picking up really reflect the just like almost like it's like, like when, someone gets like an organ donation and the body rejects it. Like essentially like like the voter base for the opposition parties essentially rejected this uh this organ donation, right? Like the CDP was getting an organ donation of like, from Komeito. We'll take on the Komeito organization, and like the graft didn't stick, because it wasn't just that the Komeito voters didn't show up; it was CDP voters not showing up. I mean, I've started to sort of look at the district level data, and in Hokkaido, in Tohoku, like these are like the opposition strongholds. These are the places where the opposition has generally done really well, even in elections that haven't been good for them. The actual like gross decline, the decline in the gross number of votes in these districts that they've performed pretty well in last time around was something like anywhere from like 25% to a third. Like that's just like literally getting fewer votes than last time. Um, and some of those votes may have switched to the LDP, but a lot of those voters probably just stayed home. Um, and so that really, like, a lot of seats that you would not have thought would have been in play, even in the sort of optimistic Takaichi kind of runs the board scenarios, were in play because like the CDP voters from last time just said nope, not interested, not coming out,
Mm-hmm.
not doing this. So that the extreme, that I think accounts for just how extreme a result this was. Um, just the general, like, this is going to be a good election for the LDP. That has to be Takaichi. That I think starts with Takaichi, and um, some of that is just, like, look, like, nowadays we talk about it as vibes, right? Like this is just a vibes election, and she captured the vibes, and everyone sort of kind of the good feeling about her and the excitement about her. And the thing is, like, this is not new in Japanese politics. We have seen, like, they the terminology in Japanese politics is the such and such boom. Like we've had there was a Koizumi boom in 2005 in um 92, 93, you got the Hosokawa boom. In 1989, they called it the Madonna boom because you had the female leader of the Socialist Party, and they had a big gains in the upper house elections in 1989. I mean, you've like this does happen periodically where there's almost like it's not really like a rational response to anything. It's almost just like a viral, like, yeah, we're excited about this person. And, you've probably seen some of the reporting about Sanakatsu, like everyone's just sort of like interested in her as a figure. And, like the bag she has, and, just like people just have caught like sort of the fever, and this happens. And we've seen it in other democracies, we've seen it in Japan's democracy. And so some of it is that. I think some of it is Takaichi in particular, and maybe the LDP more generally, um, has learned some of the lessons in recent years from the rise of kind of social media politics in Japan, and the importance of kind of simple, direct communications, using short video, sort of slickly produced video, um, getting big crowds out, and then sort of using those crowds, videos of those crowds to kind of generate excitement online. Like there were numbers about like the enormous numbers of views she was getting of her videos. And it sort of becomes this almost like self-perpetuating hype cycle, right? And we saw it, in some ways like the real kind of turning point for Japanese politics in some ways was the Tokyo gubernatorial election in 2024, where this like small town mayor from Hiroshima Prefecture like came out of nowhere, ran for governor of Tokyo, finished in second place, like basically like didn't have a platform, but like had like figured out how to really use social media, how to use YouTube, how to use TikTok, like using viral video um, to get votes. And so Takaichi did that, and she has captured the excitement of young voters. Um, and the LDP just sort of grabbed onto her coattails and sort of, you know, figured out how to do this. And, having a messenger who is attractive to to sort of swing voters, to medium voters, using social media. Um, she got that, and she captured it. And, so it's not so much that the LDP has fundamentally changed as a party, but the LDP like recognized what it had in her as a messenger and sort of grabbed on, and followed along. And I think maybe the last part is, um, I'm reluctant to say that it's that the public is more right wing. I think there's sometimes, you see in media coverage, particularly from outside of Japan, oh, the public is moving right. The public is more conservative. Young people are more conservative. And I don't necessarily think it's that, particularly because I think when you look at surveys, young people don't have the same attachment to ideological labels that older voters have. They just liberal and conservative just don't mean the same things to them. So you read surveys, where even, a third of young Japanese who call themselves liberal voted for Takaichi, not even really being aware of her positions on things. So there's not, I would be reluctant to overinterpret this as Japanese voters are more conservative. There are other things going on here. That being said, I do think that over time, some of the issues that were kind of controversial and divisive have just become less so, and that maybe does suggest that the center of gravity has moved in a rightward direction. So like national security and defense, even 10 years ago, when Abe was revising the national security laws, you got these big protests. If you were doing those today, I don't think you would see big protests, and some of it is that kind of post 2022, post Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there is just a greater awareness that the world is dangerous and Japan has to be prepared to defend itself in ways that it wasn't in the past. And, sort of a realism, a wake up to kind of the realities of the world. And so just like things that you would have thought as, well, this is a left right issue and it's controversial and it's divisive, it is not quite what it was before. And some of that also suggests that I think the real salient division in Japanese politics now is young and old rather than left and right, in part because young and old is, if not left right, it is, older people are more moderate, they're more cautious, they're more temperate, and younger people just don't seem to have a lot of patience with some of the shibboleths and sort of commitments that older people were raised with sort of in the shadow of the Second World War. And so times have changed, there are different attitudes, and you see this playing out in electoral politics.
Yeah, I get a little bit nervous with I know you talked about previous blooms, if you will, but there's something about the popularity and the way, and this is not just with Japan, although, Japanese society has been susceptible to this for a long time, but the way that the popularity can, it doesn't even matter what the positions was. It was just about, oh, they manipulated the media. And so everybody got on board. There's like a proto-fascistic thing in there that makes me a little bit uncomfortable. And I wonder if I'm not saying this to Takaichi at all. I'm saying that impulse, like sort of an Ortega y Gasset revolt of the masses thing is there somewhere underneath the surface. And when you look at Takaichi, like Abe, she's an interesting mix of different ideologies. The thing that strikes me the most about her, and I wonder if you agree with this, is she has a worldview. She has a plan. She has confidence. She projects confidence and competence, and like she knows what's going to happen. And in an environment where there has been so much corruption and so much scandal and so much hand-wringing and so much incrementalism, maybe there's just something refreshing about somebody who, like, maybe you don't agree with the ideology at all, but there's at least somebody here who has a view and is pushing it forward. And maybe that's filling some gap. I don't know. I'm now doing psychoanalysis here. Does any of that ring true to you?
Yeah, and I think, and again, I don't think this is new. I mean, I think look at the Koizumi phenomenon 20 years ago. It's like were Japanese voters suddenly very excited about post office politics? No, not really. But he understood that forward lookingness, energy, strong leadership, like saying, this is what I'm going to do, and you can stand with me or get out of the way, and if you're standing in my way, you're the opposition forces and I'm going to destroy you. Like people respond to that. Like people want to, like, I mean, and maybe it's just sort of a defect in democracy that, like, you know, we want it to be a serious thing, and these are serious issues, and you want to have sober-minded debate. Um, but maybe there's something of, sort of like the, let's call it the aroma of the Colosseum, right? Like, people want to see blood, people want to see spectacle, people, and people are going to respond to that.
Hmm.
I wrote on my Substack the night before, like the day before the election, kind of looking at the final kind of campaign rally speeches by Takaichi and the leaders of the Centrist Reform Alliance. And you just look at the contrast, and here's someone who's, like, fixed firmly on the future, and she's like these are the problems, this is what has to be done to overcome it. Like, I'm fighting, I'm strong, I'm tough. And you just listen to the opposition, and it is just like, it's got the whiff of the tomb about it, like, it's just, or like Death's Waiting Room, like, just like, talking about like these like old concepts from the Cold War, like, just like these, like, it just like just carping about, oh, she's saying she's going to do this and she's not doing that, and it's just like, but what do you want to do with the country? What do you plan on doing with these problems? And the thing is, like, with Takaichi, it was almost like she didn't mention the opposition at all, and it's almost like it's like the Don Draper meme, like, I don't think about you at all. It's like she doesn't
Yeah.
have to. Like, she's like, I'm telling you what I'm going to do. Like, come with me, I'm going to make the country better. And again, whether or not she has the right ideas or not, whether, like, it's kind of besides the point. When you listen to the opposition, it's like, okay, but what are you going to do? Like, what do you want to do? And like, and they're complaining, Takaichi says she's gonna do this, she's gonna do that, she didn't show up for this, she didn't, but it's just like no one, there's no one who's gonna be inspired by this. Like, there's no one, you were convincing no one with this argument, and it just was on just such stark display. And so you understand that sort of low information voters who aren't really paying that much attention, like, what are you going to be more excited by? Like, I'm not a Japanese voter, but I can see it, and I can understand it. And when you watch the videos side by side, I mean, the contrast is just so plain and obvious that it makes a lot of sense. We saw what happened.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons I hesitate to make these cross cultural comparisons, but it's one of the things that makes the Margaret Thatcher comparison so apt, because Thatcher had the same thing. Like, it was an energy, it was a view. She was, like, basically verbally spanking the old guard and being like, "Come on, enough with this nonsense. Like, I'm gonna, like, do things here." And Takaichi has a moment of that. I want to get into constraints and then lead you up to sort of talking about what I know is moving you about this based on our conversation right before we hit record, which is, when you're looking at constraints, normally when we're looking at Japanese politics, we're looking at constraints that are related to the domestic political picture. But she's got a supermajority, not a coalition supermajority. She's got a party supermajority in the lower house, in the House of Representatives. She does not have a supermajority in the House of Councilors. So my understanding is, she can't snap her fingers and change the Constitution. But aside from that, it seems like she can do just about anything she wants to do, and maybe she can even do that too. So before we get to some of the other constraints, because that I think is going to be the real intersection, or the real place where this gets interesting, is she's going to try to do some things, and what are those material constraints that are going to push back against her, and who will win in that push and pull. But are there any constraints from a domestic political perspective we should still keep in mind before we get to the yen and Bank of Japan and all those other sorts of issues?
Um, yeah, I mean, so first of all, I mean, yeah, so she doesn't. I mean, her government technically doesn't even have a majority in the House of Councilors. So in theory, that is a it is a constraint on paper. I do not think it is a constraint in practice. I mean, one, because the Constitution, like, the fact that she has a supermajority means they can overrule the upper house. So if the upper house drags its feet, if it doesn't pass something, um, like, basically, like, it will be kicked, whatever it is gets kicked back to the lower house, and they can just vote for it again, and it becomes law. So, I mean, like, with the supermajority, she can govern without the upper house if necessary. I mean, I think she'd prefer not to. Um, and that's why, I suspect just like having one so convincingly, she's going to find, they need like 4 or 5 votes in the upper house. I think she can, on most issues, she can probably find some party or group of legislators that would be willing to vote for whatever it is. Like there's going to be some issues where the anti-globalist right-wing party Sansaito might give her those votes. Um, there might be other votes. What the Democratic Party for the People and Tamaki, what they do is interesting because they've sort of gone back and forth about how much they want to cooperate. Now they're like, well, actually, we're the biggest opposition party now, so therefore, like, we should actually oppose. So it's unclear, but it's not going to be a big hurdle. It's a very manageable uh, domestic constraint. It is not something that is going to materially affect her ability to do things. Um, the thing the bigger question is public opinion, which is a constraint. And I think even Abe, when he was at his strongest in terms of legislative strength, you can't ignore public opinion completely. And that's why, I mean, she's in this interesting place where her numbers have held up better than pretty much any leader uh, ever. I mean, she's still, I mean, I do kind of this moving average, and she's averaging 65% now, which is a little lower than what it was. I mean, she actually lost some points after, like, sort of when it became clear she was going to call an election, but obviously didn't make a difference in the outcome. But she's still extraordinarily popular. But a lot of that still is resting on expectations. There are expectations that she's going to tackle the cost of living issue, that she's going to really follow through on things, that people are going to see sort of material improvements in their lives. And so uh, she has to still meet those expectations. And there's a chance that there's going to be disappointment and people might feel um, frustrated for one reason or another, and frustrated with how she conducts herself after this victory. So that's something to watch. That public opinion um, can affect her freedom of action in some ways. Ultimately, you know, the fact is, she has won. She has won big. She's got a lot of political capital. I think she is determined to use it, and so I'm sure is not worried about possibly losing public, support. Uh, because ultimately, if you're losing public support, I think in her mind it means she's doing something right, because she's actually, she's there to do things. She's not going to just sit there and sit on this enormous majority. So, like, that's not really, I think we're a long way from even thinking about public opinion as a constraint on her action. Certainly isn't now. Finally, I mean, there's the LDP, and the you know right now, flushed with victory, the LDP is not going to be a constraint. She has, obviously, she has a large majority. She has a lot of people who now owe their seats to her, both um, people who lost their seats in 2024 who have come back, and also, new LDP members elected for the first time, and, will now be forever known as the Takaichi children. So she has, you know, the the base of the LDP's backbenches is going to be behind her. You're going to have people like Ishiba out there sort of warning her to be careful and not act in a way that abuses her power. I mean, like, but ultimately, there's not going to be a coherent, organized opposition to her until her approval ratings start falling, until she makes a misstep on something, and you start getting public backlash in response to something she does. Like, until then, it's going to be very hard to be an LDP member who disagrees with her, because there's not going to be a whole lot of interest in hearing from you, and you're not going to have a whole lot of there's just not going to be a whole lot of opportunities to challenge her. So she's got a lot of runway for the moment, I think, is what it comes down to. I mean, there's really not going to be a lot for a while. Actually, one more constraint, and I think this leads into what she wants to do, um, is the bureaucracy, but one bureaucracy in particular, and that is the finance ministry. And I think the stage is set for real conflict between her and the Ministry of Finance. And I because ultimately, if you are looking for an institutional constraint on her power right now, the finance ministry is is it first and foremost, because the finance ministry ultimately is the institution with goals that are at cross purposes with her, and I think we could see um, conflict there.
Yeah. Perfect segue. By the way, I love this phraseology with the Takaichi children, the representatives who've been elected in this wave. I feel like we should do this in the United States. We should have the Trump children, and we should have the Biden children, and they should have to like wear a little sign that says "I am a Trump child," and they should
No, I
be
mean, this is just Japanese political lexicon. Like, like
yeah,
the LDP members elected in 2012 are still the Abe children. LDP
yeah.
members first elected, in the big wave of 2005 are still the Koizumi children. I mean, this follows them around forever.
Yeah, and your points about her approval and her popularity are really important, I think, because you're right. And part of the trick for her will be because if she does what she says she's going to do, probably things are going to get worse before they can get better. And can she maintain enough support while she's doing the things that she thinks will eventually fix things? But before we put the cart in front of the horse, let's explain very simply for the listeners, what does she want to do? What is the thing that she's telling the Japanese population that she's going to do differently?
So I think the thing to understand about her, and of course, fact number one about her is, that, Abe was her kind of political mentor, and she's, from this tradition. I mean, and I think that's the first thing to understand about her is she does come from this Japanese conservative tradition that, extending back to the Meiji Restoration, which is Japan needs a strong state. It's a dangerous world out there, and Japan needs a strong state and a strong economy to survive in it. And if you understand that, you get almost like most of the way there to understanding her, because ultimately, like, that is the political tradition she comes out of. There's a long tradition of this, and it continues to shape. This is not small government conservatism. This is not libertarianism. This is, you know, it is statism. And you can, I wrote like a fairly lengthy book, talking about kind of the role of this tradition, and the way in which this tradition um, has come to prominence, particularly since the end of the Cold War. And so it's really important to understand her. Um, and in some ways, she's even clearer about this than Abe was. I mean, Abe, came back in 2012 and talked about a national crisis, and and the things that needed to be done. But in some ways, because the feeling of crisis now is so much more acute, she's even more explicit about this. There's a feeling that, I mean, in some ways, like the feeling that, like, this is Japan's last chance. We are in a world, there, like, we are in a world, and we are in a region that is shaped by competition between two superpowers. One of the, China is, it's growing its nuclear arsenal, its industrial might is growing, its conventional military power is growing, it's deepening its ties with Russia, it's deepening its ties with North Korea. Like we are in danger. And we have to meet that head on. But also, we have an ally who is pressuring us in lots of different ways, who may or may not be reliable. And if you look, there are LDP candidates who, in their campaigns, talked about, like, we can't rely on the United States as much as we used to. I mean, so this feeling is there. I mean, to use, I'm grateful, actually. You might remember the story in December when a an unnamed aide to Takaichi said to reporters that Japan might have to think about nuclear weapons, and he used a phrase that might as well be the phrase for the Takaichi government, which is, "There's no one we can rely on but ourselves." And
Hmm.
that is, I think, like, if you were to distill the Takaichi government's guiding philosophy to a single phrase, that is it. It is like, we have fallen behind, and we are dependent on other countries in for food, for energy, for key industrial products. Like, we need to be self-reliant, we need to be autonomous, we need to rebuild our industrial strength, we need to strengthen our defense industrial base, we need to spend more on defense. I mean, all of this is her worldview. And I mean, fundamentally, and this is why, on fiscal policy, when she talks about um, you know responsible fiscal expansion, I think people have this mindset that, oh, she's just doing Abenomics 2.0. Oh, this is about reflation. Oh, this is about, nominal GDP. It's not. about macro first. And she's very clear about this. That's the thing I don't understand, because she's like absolutely clear that, this is not Abenomics where, oh, we're going to do macroeconomics first and then we'll look at supply side. What she is doing is saying we need to invest more in key industrial sectors. We need to grow. We need to be more resilient. We need to be more autonomous in key industrial sectors. And it's going to take public investment essentially to crowd in private investment. I think ultimately the idea is sort of doing what Japan has done with Rapidas in lots of different sectors. And that is the idea. And ultimately, her belief is that it's going to take spending to do that. And some of it is, one, I think a belief that Japan's fiscal conditions are not as constrained as sort of conventional orthodoxy says. And so therefore we have more room to spend. We should use it. Like, it's urgent that we do this. And anyway, if we spend wisely, if we invest, we'll grow anyway, and then we can grow ourselves out of our fiscal condition anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the worldview. And ultimately, I think when you look at the things she says, she says that even if it means more debt, it's important enough to do this for Japan's future that it's worth doing this. But anyway, we can afford more debt anyway because it's not that bad. Like that's I think what that's ultimately the worldview when it comes down to it. But that is what she wants to do. I think that is like the fundamental understanding of her government, and her approach to the world, and everything flows downstream from that.
Yeah. It's funny when people are talking about, that she's going to be Abenomics 2.0. In some ways, I think that's a failure of imagination. It's already dismissing whether she could be successful or not. I think if it is Abenomics 2.0, she failed. Then I don't think she actually did the things that she wanted to do. And she might. And I think we should talk about that in a second. I think really it's, if she succeeds, I mean, this is also hyperbole, or I was curious to test this out on you. If she succeeds, I think we're talking about something more like Meiji 2.0 than we are Abenomics 2.0. And to do that, to your point, she has to be a statist. She has to break institutions. So she will have to break the Ministry of Finance and domesticate it to her desires, and then push forward there. But to your point, it is about like the state emerging and controlling things and being able to make these kinds of priorities and make these kinds of decisions, that's what like Japan looked like in the late 1800s and early 1900s. If it's just Abenomics, if we're talking about arrows and we're tweaking bands for trading the yen, and we're doing a little bit more debt here and a little bit less here, and she's having to constantly horse trade, that would look like failure to me. Do you think that's a fair spectrum, or am I over my skis?
No, I'm going to go further than that. And if you look at her
great.
first policy speech in October, she said Abenomics failed. She said the third arrow didn't work. Like, this did not succeed at what it was supposed to, and we're still in a situation where we're falling behind, where our competitiveness is lagging. She said it. She said it outright. That Abenomics did not do ultimately what it should have done, and that there just wasn't enough focus on the supply side. And so, I mean, really, that's why I think like we have to completely change our understanding. And she wants the sort of like the supply side industrial policy horse to pull the macroeconomic policy cart rather than the other way around. And that is absolutely how I think you need to think about her and what she wants to do. And absolutely, I think I don't think she would reject the idea of Meiji 2.0, because really it is about how does Japan survive and prosper and thrive in the conditions it faces in the 21st century. And Meiji was about how does Japan survive and prosper in the conditions of the late 19th century, which was the European empires are advancing in Asia, and they would love to carve us up and make us into a colony, just like we've been watching them do to China. How do we resist that? How do we compete in the world? Like, this is the world. These are the conditions the world has given us. How do we compete in that world? And I think she thinks of herself in the same conditions, the same scale. And maybe that's, maybe there's, like sort of delusions of grandeur about that. But I mean, certainly the feeling of threat, the feeling that, like, we are in danger. And if we fail, like, we will be, essentially at the mercy of other countries. I think that feeling is absolutely there, and that's why, like, understanding this intellectual tradition, going back to Meiji, going back to, rich nation, strong army, like you have to see this tradition and see the line, of, and of course, like we know the disaster that led to Japan, for Japan, resulting in, um, the Second World War and the devastation of the Second World War. But that was also the same sense of, let's call it economic security and insecurity. We are, competing in a region with imperial powers who mean to restrict our access to resources, who constrain our ability to grow. We're insecure, we're endangered, and how do we respond to those threats? And that is the through line. This feeling of Japan as a nation that is resource poor, that is vulnerable, that is a small country in a world of big continental spanning powers, and we need to do things to ensure that we are not vulnerable to predation by others. And if you can understand that, it explains, virtually everything that she wants to do.
Well, yeah, and the tragedy of Japanese politics in the 20th century was that it basically pursued a policy of expansion, which I don't think is a policy. Well, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think that's a policy choice that is there for them. It's going to have to be a policy of invention. Like, it's going to have to be about technological capacity and an ability to work with some of these powers, maybe to have China as this threat that wasn't there before, and you can build coalitions around it. Like, that's sort of there. When I was thinking about this, I mean, maybe you're going to push back against, well, first of all, I can't believe you didn't push back against me on Meiji 2.0. I'm like now thinking I need to rethink. I thought I was being good, but I need to rethink a little bit here what I'm doing. But I'm going to say that I feel like maybe the Ministry of Finance, I mean, it's going to be a challenge, but I wouldn't want to be the Ministry of Finance with her coming for me. Like, I think she will handle the Ministry of Finance. If she doesn't, then like this goes away fairly quickly. But I was trying to sort of talk about, or at least explain to myself, what her material constraints are going to be if it's not going to be Japanese domestic politics or some of these other rivals. And what I came up with is, if she does what she says she's going to do, which I think you and I are both in agreement she's going to try, I think she can have two of the following things, but not all three. I think she can have cheap government borrowing rates and lower rates in general. She can have a stable / even strong yen, a yen currency, and she can have higher growth and higher defense spending. I think she gets two out of the three. I cannot wrap my brain around how you get all three at the same time. And the one that feels most variable is the yen. So the yen is going to have to weaken if she wants cheap government borrowing and if she wants higher growth and higher defense spending. And I know that financial media is going to obsess over the levels of the yen. And I can see the articles. Oh my God, we passed 160. Oh my God, we passed the psychological barrier of 170. That's not going to be the issue. The issue is going to be the speed of the yen's depreciation relative to wage growth. And this goes back to the statist element. If she can get wages going, and if she can keep wages above inflation, and if she can do the cheap government borrowing and the higher growth, higher defense spending, and keep those things locked in, there's a path forward. But if the inflation gets above wage growth, if the yen becomes too weak and that speed of depreciation gets out over her skis and it's not working the way that she wants, it seems to me that that's going to be the biggest problem. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe there's another conceptualization. Maybe it's she accepts lower growth, but she needs a stronger yen. Or maybe she accepts higher rates. And in return for that, she'll get the stronger. I don't know, but it seems to me that the yen is the one that she has the most room to play around with, and is also the one that if she fails, we will point to and say, like, she couldn't control that variable; it was beyond her, and therefore all of her other goals crashed. What do you think of that framework? Is it a right way of thinking about it? Where would you pick at it?
Well, let me just a brief note on the finance ministry.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, as I was watching the results come in on Sunday morning here in the U.S., I mean, one of my first thoughts was, man, I would not be wanting to sit in the finance ministry watching this coming in, because I mean, and the thing is, again, like, there are people in sort of her intellectual milieu who basically were framing this election as this is an election to destroy the finance ministry, and have basically said it outright. Because and she and Finance Minister Katayama have been very clear in the last several months that they think there are things that are more important than a balanced budget. And they basically want to say to those bean counters in the finance ministry, your priorities are all wrong. And if we leave to future generations a balanced budget, but we've failed to invest in industry and we failed to raise defense spending, and we are vulnerable to predation, then like we will have failed future generations. And they've basically said this explicitly. I have to find the quote. Katayama said something like this back in December. I mean, they've said variations on this, and so absolutely, like they see the finance ministry as public enemy number one, and and when Takaichi, that's why it's like in some ways when she talks about how we have to change how we do budgets. We have to, more in the regular budget, less in the supplemental budgets. We have to do multi-year expenditures. I mean, all of this stuff sounds kind of technical, but when you realize if she does this, it means fewer opportunities for the finance ministry to say, no, we're not doing that, or let's pare this back, or let's trim this here, or let's, like basically giving the finance ministry fewer opportunities to actually say no to politicians.
Mm.
And so that's, I mean, that is, so let's set that aside. The yen level, I think, is absolutely going to be crucial, right? And also, if it starts trending too low, you have to worry about like what is Washington going to say about that, right? That you're going to run into potential friction with the U.S. over what level the yen is finding.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, there's absolutely, I mean, one, we've already seen, I mean, in fact, the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare just, released wage, sort of the cumulative wage data for last year, and real wages fell again. So, the wage growth, we've had these impressive numbers in the Shunto every year, and wage increases are still running behind inflation. So, you're already like walking into a situation like that, where people are seeing, and it's part of the reason why she's in the position she's in, because people are fed up and think she's going to do something about it. So, if the yen is weak, if it weakens, and people continue to see higher food prices and people continue to see higher energy prices, that's going to weigh on her. That's going to weigh on her standing. Because if people start feeling like, hey, you were supposed to be doing something about this, and if anything, my paycheck's getting smaller, and they're going to try to find ways of sort of doing tax policy to put more money in people's pockets, but ultimately, you might end up with a sort of the tax reform giveth and then inflation taketh away. This is a real political constraint that she could face if the situation doesn't improve. I mean, I think there really are expectations that it's going to improve. I think with that too is that people are going to feel the pain a lot faster than businesses can start bringing capital home and start repatriate. It starts saying, oh, okay, the yen is weak, so therefore we're going to reinvest in manufacturing at home. That's a much longer time scale than the political time scale that comes from people being frustrated that they're not seeing real wage increases. So that is absolutely something that she's going to face. The other question in this is it goes to the defense spending piece of it. To the extent that Japan still has to buy a lot of defense equipment from the United States, that its defense industrial capacity is not at a point where they can just build everything at home. You're also going to be in a situation where if the yen is weak, the amount of defense spending is not going to go as far as it will on paper. They're going to be spending this more to get the exact same amount of stuff, and we've already seen that the weak yen, the yen being weaker than expected over the last 3 years. There was this audit report released sometime in the last few weeks showing that Japan spent an extra $300 billion, or the things its defense imports from the United States cost an additional $300 billion due to the yen being weak. So basically, the things it was going to buy ended up costing 300 billion yen more over the last 3 years. So that's a factor as well. And presumably the expectations are that if Japan is raising defense spending, the U.S. also wants Japan to be buying equipment. And also, meanwhile, there have been enormous backlogs in its orders from the United States anyway. So meanwhile, it's going to say we're going to spend this much, but in terms of its actual capacity and its defense capabilities, it might be less than meets the eye because what it's buying is not showing up, or it's showing up late and it's not being delivered. So, or it's just not being spent. I think there's also questions about, sort of, excess money being budgeted that's not being spent because they don't have things to spend it on. So, I mean, these are real, I think, constraints as well on actual material increases in Japan's capabilities.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, she's going to have to pull off the same trick that Milei is trying to pull off in Argentina. Like I said, things are going to have to get worse probably before they get better, and she's got to keep the luster on her shine bright enough as things do get a little bit worse here. There's a well, let me ask another direct question, because wage growth is going to be one of the things that really drives things here. What can she do to increase wage growth? Does she have any levers that she can pull? Because that's another one that seems outside of her control to me, but maybe in her conceptualization of the state and her role and with the popularity that she has and the mandate she has, maybe she thinks she can push there in a way that previous governments can't. Does she have power here, or is that she's beholden to forces outside of her?
Well, I mean, we saw Abe, invented this sort of tripartite, I'm going to sit union and big business leaders down at the table, and I'm going to tell them that they have to raise wages. And, Kishida continued doing that. Takaichi has done that. So that is now just sort of almost institutionalized, right? That
Mm-hmm.
um, in the fall, kind of ahead of spring wage negotiations, the government is going to union leaders and business federation leaders down and say, like, this is what you're going to do. Um, so, I mean, there's that. And it certainly looks like those wage increases will come through again. They're going to be roughly where they were last year. Um, but the thing about the spring wage negotiations is that they don't cover that much of the workforce. The unionized private sector. That's not that big. Um, a section of the workforce, and there's always a question of how much employees of SMEs are included in wage increases. You are getting the thing you are getting is some structural increases in wage growth. Where the fact that you do have labor shortages, that is now a sort of baked into the economy. That
Mm-hmm.
because you just employers are having such a hard time finding workers, that that there's a sort of a baseline level of wage increases happening. Sort of outside of the shunto as a result of employers struggling to get workers. Um, one thing that she got a lot of attention for negatively after she took office, where she um, suggested she was going to let up on minimum wage increases, which is one lever that the government has had control over and has been pushing very hard on. And she backed off on that, citing the difficulty that small businesses were having um, paying minimum wage costs.
Mm-hmm.
Whether she reconsiders on that front, we'll have to see. But the levers are there, but ultimately, I mean, there are other factors. What is corporate profitability? What did it look like last year? What does it look like going forward? Um, what does labor market tightness look like? Like there are factors that are beyond her control on that front. Um, she's just going to have to accept.
Yeah. Gosh, like we're starting to run out of time, so I'm going to try and squeeze two more questions in here, even though they're both big. So we talked about wages. I mean, another thing that you've already mentioned, and this was true also of Japan during Meiji 1.0, was that Japan imports energy and it imports food and it imports lots of industrial inputs. And a weak yen is good for Japanese exporters, but it's also bad if you're trying to import some of these things. Energy is something, it's going to be costly, but she can do something there. And she's talked about this. That's turning nuclear back on and turning your back on the Fukushima or post-traumatic Fukushima disorder and saying, okay, like we're going to do nuclear again. We're going to do it in strength. Like we can produce energy here if we want to, if we're focused on it. Food and industrial inputs are a little bit different. I mean, there's a world in which you can do this with food. I mean, agriculture has come a long way. Just look at how the Netherlands has turned into one of the great agricultural trading powers in the world. It's vertical farming and lots of different things. Industrial inputs, that's also going to be pretty hard. I mean, you're going to have to, one of the reasons Japan expanded in the early 1900s was to go out and get all of these things to bring them in and have that in terms of an empire. Like how much do you think that she can do here? Would it and like, with energy, like it's going to take years. With food, it would take years, and she doesn't. Does she have years? I don't know, but she's going to have to funnel lots of investment into those areas, and probably the average Japanese consumer is not going to see results there. I don't know, for a period of years, even at best. So, how do we think about that age-old Japanese weakness in this context?
Yeah, I mean, it just goes to show there's sort of a political time and consistency problem, right? Where, the things that she wants and needs to do, I mean, the payoffs, I mean, even, just on the industrial policy, I mean, like the payoffs are years down the road, really. And the, there is a lot of upfront cost that could be visible and will be very visible. And the question is, does she have enough time where she can kind of get through the pain without having to face elections at all, and in the meantime, maybe enough time that you start seeing some of the benefits and some of the, hey, actually this is working. I mean, and the thing is that you know the remarkable like this is actually very useful for thinking about sort of the political timetable. And again, whether she's going to end up challenging Abe's longevity records, I mean, I'm not going to make that call right now,
Mm-hmm.
because events have a way of happening. But so Abe comes back and leads the LDP back into power in 2012. Um, between 2012 and the election this week, the LDP lost seats in every election. They were basically drawing down the enormous majority that they won in 2012, and essentially had room to do things because they had this large majority. And so with a 316 seat majority, they can afford to lose seats, you know, for several elections in the future, as long as those sort of seat losses are manageable, um, for a while, and that may well give them time to play with, um, and to start delivering on things. But in terms of on energy, she has talked. She wants Japan to have 100% self sufficiency in energy. She talks about 100% self sufficiency in food. Uh, those are some pretty big goals, and you're talking about a situation too with nuclear where like they're only just barely getting back to 10% of electricity generation from nuclear, and that's like half of the goal they have. Um, and in some ways, a lot of the low hanging fruit has been picked. And you do have this situation where it's almost two steps forward, one step back, where in general, there has been a shift. Like, I think the public is more willing to accept that reactors are going to go back online. Local governments have been willing. You had a couple of local governments in December agree to go forward with turning reactors back online. And then you have something that happens, like, a utility, like omitted information or had some false information on its paperwork, and therefore the regulator is now going back over things, and so the process is being slowed down again. So this is not a quick process still. This is still not something that the government can just say, like, we're going to turn the ball back on. Like, there is a
Mm-hmm.
process. It has to be followed. It can't just be done quickly. And in some ways, Takaichi talks more about nuclear fusion, which is obviously something that has not been commercialized, and who knows when it will be commercialized. She loves to talk about, what is it, perovskite solar. Like, like she's very into these sort of next generation technologies that are not in existence yet and have not been commercially deployed yet. Um, which you're really talking about, um, timelines that go well beyond an election cycle. We're looking several election cycles ahead, and maybe it's sort of the holy grail of Japan's energy independence is there, um, but it's certainly not there in the next 5 years. So,
Mm-hmm.
and meanwhile, what you are seeing, in her political coalition is actually a pretty sharp turn against renewables. There's been a real backlash, against mega solar. There's been backlash against wind. Some of that is environmental concerns and sort of concerns about habitat loss with mega solar projects and so on. There's a lot of anti-China sentiment baked into that as well. Like, we
Mm-hmm.
can't, like, why like would it benefit us to reduce our carbon emissions if it means we're dependent on China. And so, I think that's a big part of it as well. Um, so in the meantime, in the near term, if you're following the logic of her own political base, you're importing more hydrocarbons. You're importing more natural gas. Like that is the reality um, of what her government is suggesting. So, yeah, they want to spend lots on R&D on sort of this next generation stuff, but not at a point where it's commercially deployable yet. So that's energy. I mean, food. Lots of talk about let's make Japan and a food exporting superpower, and they were looking back at the Netherlands during the Abe years. I mean, but there's still a long way from food self sufficiency.
Yeah, yeah, of course, and probably will be for some time. Okay, we're already an hour in. I'm gonna encroach on your generosity and ask you one more question, and maybe we'll pick up here when we talk with cousin Marco on the Cousins podcast. And by the way, I'm struck by what you said there in terms of like part of what she has to do is she has to get people to believe that these things are coming while she's doing all of her reforms. But you mentioned, we've mentioned China, we've mentioned some of the geopolitical dynamics here going forward. Obviously, China has been in the background here over the past couple of months because China decided to pick on something she said about Taiwan and make a whole deal about it. And Chinese-Japanese relations probably at their worst in the last decade plus. Her mentor Abe had a pretty chummy relationship with Xi Jinping, was able to navigate some of these things. So far, she doesn't seem to have that, or China doesn't seem to be willing there. If you're Beijing or if you're Washington and you're examining this, what do you think? And specifically from Beijing's perspective, are you feeling frustrated that you made this big deal out of Taiwan and all you did was create this Takaichi figure? Are you happy that in the long run, this means that Japan is probably pulling away from the United States? And so you can deal with Japan more on equal terms or on more pragmatic terms rather than have to worry about this being the front line of the American alliance? Are you not worried at all anyway? You've got 1 billion plus people and time is on your side, and eventually Japan will not matter to you that much. Like, okay, they want to be an island out there and isolate themselves, whatever. Like, we'll take everything else and then we'll deal with them when the time has come. Like, how do you how and what does this mean, do you think, for the regional balance of power, if at anything at all? I mean, I know Takaichi has grand goals, but she has a lot to do before she can start projecting Japanese power the way that she wants to do. And in the meantime, like, China's here now. Some of these other countries are here now and doing these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm not gonna guess what exactly the Chinese leadership thought it was getting into, or thought like the reaction for the Japanese public would be if they leaned on Japan like this. But I think China can and is prepared to play this kind of as a longer term game against her, and maybe was not expecting the maybe was surprised like everyone else by the extent to which that the bottom fell out of the opposition. But um they have a lot of levers, just in terms of the kind of economic coercion playbook, right? And they've really probably only scratched the surface on things they could do. Maybe they do recognize that if they are too aggressive, that you will have a backlash, and the public is predisposed to be anti-China, maybe more than they ever reckoned, and so there's going to be maybe some care on that front. I mean, I expect you'll see efforts um, to try to isolate Japan, isolate it from the United States, certainly, and I think that it's hard not to see that as a goal. Assuming that Trump and Xi meet, I believe it could be upwards of 4 times this year.
Yep.
That trying to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Japan will be a goal there, and to some extent we've already seen it. And that
Wedge driven, like
the wedge,
mission accomplished.
Right. I mean, that the fact that the U.S. has been much less vocal in its support, and backing Takaichi, on in this dispute now. The fact that the U.S. is just preoccupied by other stuff, and like, the message in some ways does seem to be like, Japan, you're kind of on your own here, and don't make too much trouble for us. It would be really interesting to see, Takaichi on election night talking about, wanting to lay the groundwork for going to Yasukuni. And like what sort of effects that has. Like,
Well, yeah, I was struck by that because it seems to me that if to do what she wants, like great, come at me, China. Like every little bit that you give to me, that's I can now sell that back to the Japanese population. Say, oh, you see these problems? Well, it's because we got over dependent on China. I'm not going to be able to snap my fingers, but look at these guys; they're going after us. So book me at the shrine tomorrow. Like
yeah,
let's poke the dragon all we want because I could use that politically. I feel like that's got to be where she is in the position that she's in. No.
yeah. I mean, the question is, would the U.S. want her going before Trump it goes to Beijing? Um, it's like I don't think Trump cares one way or another about her going to Yasukuni. I mean, I think this is very different than uh, the Obama administration back with Abe in
Mm-hmm.
2013. Um, but they just might not want like that sort of kindling tossed on the fire um, at this particular moment. So it'll be interesting to see, what the messaging in response to that ends up being. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think this is not a dispute. China can't back down because for her to talk openly about how Japan has equities at stake, in what China views as an internal matter, is not something that Beijing is going to let lie. And also Japan
Mm-hmm.
can't back down because Takaichi said, I didn't this is prevailing policy. And so now she's in a position where if she concedes, she has allowed China to coerce Japan into changing its policy. So, neither can back down. That's why there's no reason to think that this ends in any um there's not going to be an easy end to the standoff. I mean, I think the question is how much more does China ratchet up, but I don't think it's ratcheting down at this point. They can't concede victory to Takaichi on this point. So the standoff is there. Clearly they're going to try to drive wedges. Try to isolate Japan from partners in the region, isolate Japan from partners in Europe. Um, but they probably do feel the time is on their side and that they can sort of uh, play the longer game as far as Japan is concerned.
Yeah. Whereas to your point, I mean, Japan is running out of time in some sense, and that's Takaichi's whole thing. All right, Tobias, I've kept you for too long already. Tobias will be on Cousins in a week, so if you want more of this, like we'll get the Cousins treatment next week. But in the interim, thank you for coming on and spending a little extra time with us. It's good to see you, and like I said, good time to be a Japan analyst. You're in the right place at the right time. So
No, this is great conversation. I'm glad we could have it because it allowed me to air a lot of thoughts that have been stewing for the last few days.
good. I look forward to reading the 4,000 word missive. I can't wait.